Greetings, listeners, and welcome to On the Spectrum podcast, a show that investigates the many complexities and diversities of being on the spectrum. We are your hosts, David and Lorena.
Hello, Dave.
And today we are going to be speaking with Helen Wood about a very difficult question. What is autism? Thank you for joining us today on our second episode of On the Spectrum podcast. Would you like to start by just telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name is Helen Wood. My role at the Loddon School is currently Head of Staff Professional Development. So I look after all of the training needs of staff at the school. I don't like to say how long I've been there because it's actually a really long time, but I've just nearly 26 years is how long I've been at school. So I came to Loddon following a psychology degree, so psychology undergraduate degree, and when I first started the school, I was working directly with the young people, so as a teaching assistant and a psychology assistant. So I had a real interest in sort of behaviour and human behaviour. So I was doing a lot of the data analysis and working out sort of what some of the triggers were for our young people. And I think I've dotted around and done quite a few different roles in Loddon over the years. So I managed the what was then the Positive Behaviour Support team is now Department for Behaviour Analysis and Support. I moved into to manage the communication and therapies team at a stage for a few years. But throughout my time at Loddon, I've really enjoyed training delivery. So probably about 12 years ago, we had the opportunity to sort of restructure the training team, and it was my passion really. So I was lucky enough to be able to manage that team. So what I do now is a lot of internal staff training, so delivery of training about things like autism and positive behaviour support, but also have the opportunity to deliver training sort of externally and nationally, which is something that I really enjoy doing too.
Excellent. Yeah, and even internationally, because we had a conversation not long ago, a few days ago, about
that's right.
The possibility of looking into going even wider, didn't we?
Again, I've been really fortunate. So throughout my time at Loddon, we've done humanitarian aid abroad. So I've had multiple trips to Romania over many years, really working with their humanitarian aid teams and trying to influence their practice. And I suspect you probably know that sort of in the 80s and 90s, disability was very hidden in Romania until the end of Ceausescu's era. And then, people were really unskilled and they had really a real misunderstanding because they lived in a medical model. They had a real misunderstanding that, disability was something to be hidden away at home and people couldn't contribute to society. So, dispelling some of those myths of autism and upskilling people to really understand that autism isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be celebrated and understood, and recognising that actually people can have a really meaningful contribution if they get the right supports in place. So, and also really lucky to have done some work in Azerbaijan at the point where they had quite a political shift. And again, they've sort of gone through the same trajectory, probably 8 to 10 years later than Romania. I've done work in Finland. And so, there's been great opportunities to really influence international practice, which is lovely.
I'm lucky enough to be in your team as a trainer at the Loddon School, as part of my role within the Loddon. And then I think when we are doing training and we talk about autism, one of the topics that come along is when you speak to staff, and we have like a broad and international and worldwide, across the world, people working with us. And I think, they said normally that how they live autism here and how they live autism in other countries is absolutely amazing. How we do it here, how we can see the potential they have, how we stretch them to fulfill their strengths and then to thrive in their lives, and then we ensure that quality of life. Meanwhile, in other countries, as what you said, there is it's a same. I had sometimes with a mum that used to work that it was like a punishment from God or something like that.
There's a lot of myths, isn't there? Yeah, absolutely.
And instead of seeing the goods, we are focusing on the bads. Yeah. And then we need to turn the omelette the other way around.
Absolutely. And I think, we've had a number of decades of learning, haven't we? Autism's been known about since the 1940s, but, we didn't have the Education Act in this country until much later than that diagnosis. So, we've gone through a period of deinstitutionalisation for people and, making sure that every child has got the right to an education, regardless of a diagnosis. But there's been a lot of learning, and I think, we're still learning. And I think, I've seen a lot of change at Loddon over the years, and I think one of the things that really excites me about being at Loddon is that we never stand still. We never say, right, we've nailed it now. We know exactly what we're doing. We're always very creative in our thinking, and we have we have this amazing staff team that's constantly evolving, and we bring in sort of fresh new ideas, and I think we really harness the potential of our staff team. So it's credit to them that we continue to be cutting edge, I think. But I think we're lucky in that we have the school, and we have the ability to constantly learn from children that come to us. And I think when I left university, I'd done my 3-year undergraduate degree, and I thought I understood autism. Every child that's come to the Loddon School since has questioned my understanding of theory, and theories change, and I think we'll probably get onto it later in the conversation, but theory and research is really, really important for generalised understanding, but equally what's really important is knowing the individual and learning from those autobiographical accounts of autism, of knowing, because autism presents very differently in every individual, so you've got to learn about John and Margaret and Joe to really understand those features of autism. So I think having that balance between theory and those real individual accounts gives us that holistic understanding of autism. But we constantly move forward, and that's exactly the right thing to do. And we haven't got that consistently across the UK. Provision changes, and I think within Loddon we've been lucky that we've had really brave leadership. From the point where I started Loddon, it's always had brave leadership, and we've been able to sort of say things like, okay, the government through Ofsted are telling us to do this, and we understand that and we'll respect that. We understand that our children need maths and English skills, but actually what's really meaning for our children is being able to have those good life skills, those good social skills, and we can really focus on, what's quality of life for our youngsters. And we because we're an independent provision as well, we have a little bit more flexibility to say, right, okay, we're gonna have our own curriculum, we're gonna have plus, we're gonna do this differently for all 28 children, and that's quite a unique. A unique way of working, but as you say, coming into that, you can see the impact of that.
Yeah, it made me think, because I was with inspectors this year, so we had Ofsted education, and as we have a different curriculum that is based on our children's needs, responding specifically for what they need, how, and tailor the answer, or the educational answer, if you want to say it like that. And then when they come to see and view and check the curriculum that you're speaking and explaining, and they're looking at you like, okay, yeah, and then carry on with literacy, how we are teaching phonics, and then it's like, look, we do these things, however, they are not meaningful for our children per se. We need to look a way to reach those kids, to reach that potential and do meaningful learning, because it's interesting for them and it's key for them to learn how to read, yes, but is it phonics the right way to approach? And I think Jill for this is quite good in pushing that forward and say, look, this is what they need, this is why we do what we do. And I think you clicked on really, really well since the very beginning when you decided to change the curriculum and tailor what we are doing. And we were actually defending this recently in some meetings, so yeah.
And I think it's about evidence, isn't it?
Spot on.
I think it's
spot on.
and it's really hard to argue when you can see the impact in terms of positives for the children.
Yeah, I think that's what happened with inspectors. It was like, this is what we do, this is the graphs, this is clearly how you can see the behaviours have been dropped off, clearly see how they settle, clearly see how they are happy, clearly see how even the families can see the impact at home when they visit. So I think that whole approach, never better said, is working.
I think one of the...
There's nothing to fight back.
Absolutely, and I think one of the most powerful statements that a family member's ever said to me is, for me, it's not about my child getting a certificate, it's not about my child. I know that my child is very unlikely to gain a GCSE, to gain an A-level, but success for me was when I was able to take my child to the local pub and sit down with his brothers and sisters and have a whole meal. So be able to have, with a family, a starter, a main course and a pudding without one of them being in the car, one of them being outside with him, and just that moment of success for that family was amazing. And that's you can't, those are the stories that we need to get out there, because, it's not necessarily on a graph, although we will have evidence of it, but those are really powerful. And I think as much as having a responsibility for our children to get it right for them, actually over time, we by having inspectors in and seeing it work, we shape practice. And that's really, really important. And that's not to say we don't always get it right. Inspections are really important because, we can get quite insular sometimes. So it's really important to have an outside view.
Someone,
and also explaining it to someone who's maybe not familiar.
Absolutely.
That also clarifies it for yourself.
Definitely.
That we're on the right track if you can convince somebody who's maybe not familiar with this kind of stuff.
So true.
Yeah. And also because they're individuals, you think that's what promotes everyone to evolve so quickly, because it's all tailored to the individual. It actually promotes you to, like you said, creative thinking and thinking outside the box and thinking towards the individual. So how do you define autism and the core characteristics to someone who may not be familiar with the condition?
There's no straightforward answer to that, would be my answer. The fact that it's a condition, I suppose, and it's something that we call a spectrum condition, it means that it manifests really differently in different individuals. However, there are some core characteristics. So I think if we look back in research and back around diagnostic criteria, we know that initial theories talked about a deficit model. So young people with autism, children, adults, having difficulties in 3 core areas, and those areas being sort of communication, so both verbal and non-verbal communication, building and maintaining relationships, and then flexible thinking, and that's termed the triad of impairments, and it's been a well-reviewed and largely critiqued model over the time, but it's something that still underpins diagnosis in this country. What has changed now in our thinking is that we don't really think about autism as a deficit model. It's not really thinking about you have a diagnosis on the autistic spectrum, so you have all of these difficulties and impairments. That's really negative thinking. So our thinking now is really about, you've got key differences. And I think a lot of people with autism and neurodivergence talk about just having their brain wired up differently. So, and neurodivergence really, there isn't a blood test for autism. Someone's not going to put a temperature gauge or a litmus paper on you and say autistic. It's a spectrum condition because the characteristics of autism are extensions of our typical understanding. So someone who hasn't got a diagnosis with what we might call a neurotypical brain is still going to have problems at times with communication, is still going to have problems with understanding and processing and memory. So it's a really transient sort of flux state. And I think, I'm sure we can all think about a time that we've been in a highly aroused state. So maybe we're in a point of conflict, or, we've had an argument with our other half, and that you have this fight or flight adrenaline rush that is evolutionary. So it dates back to, where we were running away from tigers and things like that, and lions. And so you have this big adrenaline rush, and it prepares you to sort of fight or flee or freeze. And evolution has not particularly been very kind to us, because we still have that adrenaline rush, even though the predator, I suppose, or the danger is disproportionate to our chemical and sort of response to it. But what happens when we have that adrenaline rush is our brain chemicals change and our processing changes. So I'm sure if you think about that conflict state, you will remember a time where your communication, you're usually really well able to talk and communicate, and you're so angry or emotional that you get that funnel, don't you? Everything starts closing down around you.
Like when someone freezes when they're talking in front of a crowd, or something, they start stumbling, and when usually they can do that perfectly.
Exactly. A podcast, for example. I'm probably being less eloquent now than I would be in a normal conversation, because you've got that adrenaline rush, and it can be really helpful, but it can also really hinder you. So we all experience that. I guess in a neurodivergent brain, that threshold for panic and fear and response is much lower. And so and therefore resilience and coping is much lower. So the triggers and the trip points to get that arousal state happen much more easily. So, you are going to have people that that struggle with communication at that point, that struggle with understanding someone's body language at that point, because their world is closing down and they're going to get to a meltdown state.
Be flexible, because you kind of see all the ways, and then you're like this way, and it's like that's not the way, but it's still this way. Yeah, definitely.
And you can see how someone with autism, if they're struggling in an interaction, every bone in their body is saying withdraw, get out of here. And that's why we see some behaviours sometimes. I mean, I think in terms of core characteristics, something that was really missing from those original theories was understanding about the impact of sensory differences. So I always refer to the film Rain Man, because, Rain Man was a 1980s film about autism. And actually, I always say to people, if you've never watched it, watch it, because Rain Man was really well researched, because it was done by Dustin Hoffman, who played the main character, actually basing that on a real life character. So you had, within the context of the film, you had autobiographical account. And so sensory differences are really well presented in that film. So the fact that Raymond has issues over fire alarms and has the nervousness when there's loud noises, that really defied research at that time. Academics hadn't really caught up with what people with autism were saying about what it was like to be autistic. And so we now know that sensory differences has one of the biggest impacts. So sensory differences being someone struggling to process and interpret sound or smell or taste or vision, and also some of the lesser known senses like introspection, so the sense of being thirsty or hungry. So we know that we get that biological feedback, don't we, from our bodies, and I need to eat, I'm really hungry, or I'm really thirsty, I need a drink. Many people with autism, their perception of that sense is really different. So they don't feel thirsty, they don't feel hungry, so they might have to structure in a routine where they eat at 4 o'clock every day, because if they don't do that by the clock, their body is never telling them, and then they'll get dehydrated and a headache. So that whole world of sensation can look very different, and I would definitely say that is a core feature, and it's something that we really need to understand that, because it accounts for a lot of behaviours. So we often see behaviours happening because of sensory processing difficulties, and it also stretches our thinking, really, because if you listen to some people with autism talk about sensory differences, it seems really unreal to us because it's extreme. So, for example, there's an American lady that talks about if she's in a room full of people, she can actually hear her own sort of heart pumping and sort of her own body system working, so blood going around veins, but she can also hear that in anyone else that's in the room. Being in a crowd is actually a really, really difficult place to be, because she's got all of this incoming sensory information that we probably wouldn't be able to cope with. She has to manage that. And there's lots and lots of accounts of sensory differences where you just think, wow, and we can identify with it. Smells is typical. I'm sure we've all been in a situation where, for me, migraine sort of trigger, like someone that's got really strong perfume. Lorena, if you were sitting next to me now and you had really strong perfume on, I would struggle to speak and to carry on, and I'd probably have to say to you, look, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to either sit away or because because I've got the communication skills to do that. But someone that's struggling with the sensory differences but doesn't, it's going to come out in a different way.
And at the same time, they're not going to be able to focus on any communication skills they do have, because that's going to be overloading them and distracting them from using the skills that they do have.
Exactly.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So it's a huge impact time, actually.
And this as well, thinking about that, the kind of response that you will give, because as we have a good relationship, work and outside work, you will be free to tell me if you wear that perfume. I find difficult to come and approach you and be talking to you for really long. It makes me feel weird, or even give me headaches, which my answer will be, okay, no worries.
Because
I won't use it anymore if I am with you, because I need to adapt myself to be able to sustain that relationship. So sometimes even it's difficult when they come across quite rude or quite difficult or different, just different. And then instead of us saying, okay, so what exactly do you need me to do to make this work? We are like, oh, here we are again, the difficult one. Oh, here we are again.
Exactly.
Is that
And there's some of the stigmas that
the weird one, the weirdo coming with his weird things, and I need to break this. Like, no, if this is what we need, this is what we need to do, or if this is what you need, this is what I need to adjust. It's just changing the perfume,
of course, and
that's not wearing perfume. Not, like that simple things that is not killing anyone, is it? And then making everybody's life easier.
Yeah. And that's why those supportive relationships are so important. So you get that trust base. I had a really awkward conversation with a friend, a university friend of mine that I hadn't seen for a long time, and she came over for just popped in for a cup of tea and a piece of cake at my house, and she had really strong perfume. I was thinking, I had a really good friendship with her, but we haven't seen each other for a while, so this could sort of be quite awkward. And I had to say to her, "Look, Helen, I'm really, really sorry. It's a bit sensitive, but I really want to see you, but you're just going to have to."
But not with that perfume.
But again, exactly. But again, that's why as much as we're talking about autistic spectrum disorder, my preference is to say human spectrum disorder. Let's be clear, I don't have a diagnosis of autism, but that's clearly a trait that someone with autism can empathise with. So, diagnosis of autism only happens when you get enough impact from the core characteristics that it starts impacting your life. So there are hundreds of thousands of people that are getting through life absolutely fine without the need for a diagnosis of autism. And diagnosis, I think, is a really emotive subject. Some people, for parents of children as well, some parents will really want a diagnosis for their child. They'll really want that understanding. And some people with autism really want a diagnosis. So you don't have to do too much research, too much sort of Googling to find out celebrities that have got a diagnosis with autism. And I guess the very famous one is Chris Packham, who's, in his 40s, he's got a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, and he's been very public about that. And he, I don't know how much you know about, I like birds, so I know a lot about Chris Packham because he's an environmentalist and into birds, but he lives separately from his long-term partner, so they don't live together because that's problematic. He has particular sensitivities around clothing, so when you watch him on a TV programme, if he likes a piece of clothing, he will buy it in 6 colours, and you look at his wardrobe and it's completely organised. But you've got to look at Chris Packham and say, there's a really successful guy. There's someone that is brilliant in his field. His knowledge and his passion for what he does is amazing. Has autism held him back? No. Has a diagnosis helped him? Arguably, yes, because he's got that understanding.
And why.
Yeah, and he can come across as quite harsh. He can be quite cutthroat. He's got a stepdaughter, and he'll say, for years and years and years, I've never gone to a birthday party because it's hellish. I don't want to be in a room full of people. So but that diagnosis has enabled him to have those conversations and understand why he struggles.
And the context, I guess. Yeah. Like, okay, this is how it is, this is why. Okay, fair enough.
Definitely. And
it's not someone trying to be difficult or wanting to be difficult.
Yeah. And equally for the next person, they won't welcome the diagnosis. So it's a really personal thing, I think, diagnosis of autism.
Diagnosis, isn't it very important to get the help that you need, though, as well? So there's that kind of side of the argument as well.
I think that's absolutely right, Dave. I think it's signpost support. So absolutely. And arguably, has Chris Packham or people that are very able with autism, have they needed any formal support? Arguably they might not, but someone that's sort of got more severe characteristics of autism and is impacted more, absolutely they might want to access, support groups or might need funding streams, and diagnosis is a passport to signposting. And I think, on balance, I think I would always encourage a diagnosis for parents because for their child, but also for them, because as soon as you know what this is, for me, I like to know. I prefer to know a label, and then I can research it and do what I want with it. But it's knowing what's in the local community, knowing what's locally supporting, and I think that's less isolating. Is you can then feel like suddenly this is not something that's happening to you and your family. Actually, there's lots of other families out there, and I guess one of the myths about autism is it's rare, and autism and neurodivergence is not rare. So 1% of the UK population has a diagnosis of autism. I read the most recent stats: 1 in 68 children in the UK get a diagnosis of neurodivergence, including autism. So this isn't rare. So even though you can feel quite isolated, there are lots of other people experiencing similar challenges that you can reach out and network with. And I think diagnosis is helpful for that.
Certainly, yeah. And it might help someone that, like you said, that is very able as an autistic person, but just to have that community or that reach, just once they get the diagnosis, they can then say, they can then sort of go out and, like you said, make connections with these people and get the support they need. It's not just educational support or therapeutic support. It is just having that person to talk to that understands what you're going through.
It's really important, isn't it?
And the social networking, I think, sometimes when parents happen that they feel lonely and lost, they don't really understand what's going on, what to do now, where's the next step. Now I need to go and ask for help or support in the school, exactly what I need to ask for, because I'm not really, because we are in this world and we know and have clear probably this is what we need, this is what we need to ask for. But for someone that hasn't got a background in education and is not related to all of these, when you're talking about autism, what that means, because it can be even scary, like and what that means, what are the impact of this, what's going to happen to my child, and what is next, like, because there's lots of uncertainties in front of you that you as a mom and dad you need to solve, and then you don't even have the tools to solve them. So I guess that the diagnosis comes with a package of support, social networking, understanding, and that is needed, I guess.
And the understanding is important. It's like you said earlier about it then being individualised to that person. That's why they probably think to themselves, well, what are we going to do now? How's this going to affect my child? And it's like, well, we can't give you those answers, but what we can do is give you the scaffolding of support.
Of what to do,
of the approaches that you can take.
And I think I've seen that exact situation played out with many of our parents where children have come to Loddon. But of course, because we're a residential provision, parents are far down that road, so it's likely that their child has already been in specialist education and excluded, and so their diagnosis is a far memory for them. But I've certainly had very close friends that have got autistic children, and I've seen that very personal impact of what that diagnosis, what having a child with a difference is to a family, and how isolating that can be, but also how, with that acceptance and with that support and that scaffolding and accessing those networks, how what can first of all seem a really scary, really narrowing funnel of what my child's life is going to be like suddenly starts opening up. And certainly, my friend's child is sort of teenager now, and actually, seeing him just blossom is amazing. And so, I think it's really hard to be open-minded when you've got fear. But actually, with support and with talking to other people, you'll start realising that, this isn't a life sentence. This isn't this is something that your child's not going to achieve. Will you have to do things differently? Absolutely. Will you have to recalibrate your expectations? Absolutely. But actually, you start celebrating your child, or your other, whoever it is that's got the diagnosis. You start seeing their strengths, their potentials, and you start seeing that if you get the things right, if you change your expectations, if you're flexible and creative, you start seeing them being enabled, and you start seeing them succeeding, and with that becomes that confidence and that morale boost. And it's the children that we work with at Loddon are amazing because they're so resilient, they have so many barriers, but yet they have such a capacity to have fun and to enjoy, and it's completely joyful, isn't it?
Yeah. I love the sense of humour that comes out, and like you said, even though they have like some communication difficulties and things, they still retain that sense of humour and a bit of wonder and awe as well.
Absolutely.
Especially when we're doing like these sensory experiences, like sensory theatres and or the sensory room, and you can just see the fascination and the enjoyment they get out of it. And like you said, because they sense things differently, it might be quite refreshing for them to see lights or movement in a certain way, in a certain pattern. And it might be very relaxing and calming for them to experience those.
Now that you talk about myths, because they said like they don't communicate or they don't have that sense of humour, that I think that's like talking about myths and misconceptions of autism. They are naughty, and people think that they are naughty and they behave like that because they want to behave like that, or they are like that because they are like that. But like, well, they are like that because their brain was different, and then it's that fight of make people understand that it's not what they think, is something else, and they need to understand that part of something else.
So talking about autism and personalities, did you want to talk something about the the differences between the two.
Yeah, so we were talking about core characteristics. We're obviously talking about sort of communication, relationships, flexible thinking, and we were sort of relating that to our children really, and saying, look, isn't it amazing that they've got this propensity to still have fun and to still have those joyful moments and to still, you were talking about awe. Yes. And of course, those core characteristics are really key, but that doesn't mean that you won't have people with a personality. And I think the thing about our children is, and anyone that's got a diagnosis of autism, is that they'll have a diagnosis with autism on top of all of their personality traits. So I often think that if you took away the autistic traits for our children, they would all be really different. The children that would be extroverts, the children that would, be down the school disco, and you'd know the children that would be in trouble and pushing their parents with boundaries, and the children that will be really, really quiet and withdrawn or really polite. So autism doesn't take away personality. It doesn't say, right, now you've got autism, this is what you can expect. It sits alongside of all of the traits that we see around our children, and that's why we have to have a personalised approach, because it's not one size fits all. And I think our children are amazing personalities, aren't they? And like anything, we have to look at an individual and we have to look at their strengths and all those good things about them. When I do staff training, particularly around behaviours, I often say that when we talk about anyone that's got a label, we start talking about them in negative terms. So if I think about running a Pratt Skip course, which, as you know, is our sort of the way that we really understand behaviour and think about putting in preventative strategies, when we're doing a Pratt Skip course and we talk about our children, suddenly we talk about all of their behaviours. We talk about them biting and spitting and pulling hair and stripping. And at no point in my life has anyone highlighted all my negative behaviours on a flip chart. And I know Lorena very well. I know you very well. I don't start talking about Lorena being continent or incontinent. I don't use, in a friendship or in a professional relationship, I would be really mindful and respectful about someone's areas of weakness, and I would hope that they would do the same to me. If I'm having a bad day, I hope that someone's going to be kind to me. I can tell you all the things that I do wrong, but no one writes that down on a bit of paper, and no one says, this is part of a passport for you, Helen. You've been unkind here, you've really inflexible here.
She's a really nice person, but
yeah,
read Annex A.
Definitely. And I think we have to be really careful that, when we're putting in our planning, that we balance that with all of those good things about a child's personality. Because I don't read many behaviour support plans that say, this person's amazing, this person's so funny, they're really creative. I read in a behaviour support plan all the things that I don't want to be shared about me. And I think that then creates a world of assumptions, and we just need to shift it. We just need to shift to positive sometimes and think about, what we're recording. Are we only really focusing on things that are around someone's worst moments, or are we equally focusing on what do we do to get this right? When is this child doing brilliantly? When are they having fun? When are they engaged? When are they learning? And if we can have that holistic piece, it builds that bigger picture. And I think personality is a key part of that. Let's really focus on those positive personality traits, and that's a really good starting place in which to build someone's confidence and self-esteem and planning.
Definitely, yeah, and I think people focus on the behaviours because they see it as the challenging aspect with that individual. But sometimes, like you said, if you know the person, then you can kind of tailor your approach towards that individual. And put them into a focused mindset where they can learn, using what they enjoy, what they like, what engages them. So there's a lot of beneficial aspects to knowing the person as an individual that can then aid with all these challenges that are happening. So, like you said, sometimes it can't all be about the negative. Sometimes the positive can have real outcomes for that person as well.
Absolutely.
It will be as well what you're talking about when you present one of your friends. You always bring the good qualities, is it? And even when that person has had a bad day, you always say, oh, but don't worry, he might have a bad day. She normally is not like that. She's such a good person. She's this. So you always kind of balance and even cover the bad with the goods. Like you try to understand. It's like, yeah, it's fine. He had a bad day, or he's having a really bad moment in his personal life or her personal life. So it's always like kind of the goods and cover the bad, so they're not that good, is it? Like when it's people that you know, and when it comes with our children, it's like or they bite, they help, or they will punch you, they will hit you. It's like, no, wait. Yeah. This person is such a good pet, like such a good kid. He's really funny. He likes to play with you. He will love to sit down with you and be part of the conversation. Yeah. He wants to be there. He likes the one-to-one interaction. You can go for a walk and then he will be with you or she will be with you. Yes, sometimes we have bad moments, haven't we? All of us, and we react differently, and depending on how we are, we have a bigger window or a shorter window.
Yeah, definitely.
And then, when things go wrong, this is how it looks like, and this is what you need to do to support him and drive him back to a right place. But remember, it's because he had a bad day, because he is. We need to kind of change that speech and that...
Yeah, the narrative around it. Yeah, definitely.
I think one of the best ways to do that is with the one-on-one interaction, is to get to know the person and to see those positive sides. Is just to accept what they're giving you and just delve into their world and say, like, okay, tapping this doesn't make much sense to me, but it means something to you. And I find that once you start engaging with fabric or whatever they're into, you start to enjoy the experience yourself. And you start to see those positive aspects coming out of that person.
And I think, people that are neurodivergent have so much to teach us. Actually our lives sometimes and our thinking can be really narrow. And as you say, it might be that person gives you the biggest gift, because you walk in their shoes, don't you? And you think, okay, I've been quite judgmental about that. I don't understand why you enjoy it so much and why you spend hours and hours doing it. But if I can just step back from the judgments and just be there with you in that moment, you get that moment of magic, don't you? Where you think, okay, I've got a really good understanding of that now. And that's when that relationship starts really sort of, coming into its own and developing.
Yeah, and you can prevent those aggressive behaviours from happening once you understand that aspect of them. And you can use it as a distraction technique, or you can just use it as a technique to say, like, I know how you feel. Or let's have a little moment where, we're both on the same level, and you don't have to go down these negative paths or what, the negative sort of behaviours that come out.
Because that person feels like you understand and you're respecting them and you're acknowledging. And it's authentic. I think that's the really key thing. It's not...
It's a genuine...
It's genuine.
You're there genuinely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really key.
Right, so we're talking about myths and misconceptions, and I think we all in this room heard quite commonly, they are just naughty. We just, what we were saying before with Dave, they just need discipline, just need to be like bam, 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 and everything will go sorted. Do you know any other myths and misconceptions that go...
There are lots
with autism in that line.
There are lots. Just to respond to that, I think in the very early days of the National Autistic Society, one of the things that parents asked the National Autistic Society to do for them was to produce a range of T-shirts that basically said, I'm not naughty, I'm autistic, and that was controversial because it was almost attracting a judgment, but it was also taking a lot of pressure off parents, because, I know that when we take our children out into the community, our children will be judged, and we feel judged. And autism is invisible. It's an invisible condition, because, actually, the average member of the public, generally, I would like to think that average members of the public are good people, they're well-intended, but they sometimes very ignorant, not in a negative way, just through lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. And most general members of the public don't know much about autism. So they'll want to understand, but they might be afraid of what they're seeing and they might not understand. But if they have someone in a wheelchair or someone that's got a learning disability that they can relate to, they make allowances. When they get presented with this person that is struggling and that they're seeing the effects of that, they don't know quite what to do with that information. So their fear kicks in, and then they think, right, okay, this their behaviour is really naughty, or because in their head they haven't got, okay, look, it's fine, they're autistic, they're neurodivergent, they're being well supported. So their perspective, their lens of that situation changes. And I think we have a real responsibility to educate so that, members of the public, and it's getting there, but members of the public are more aware of neurodivergence, because, every member of the public and every person that's got a diagnosis of neurodivergence or not has an equal right to access the community, has an equal right to share a space on an equal level. And we want to make that as supportive as possible for people. And I think the media is doing good things now. So there's more people with neurodivergence that are well and positively represented in the media. media. So, characters on TV shows, and that helps. But I think one thing that I struggle with a little bit is sometimes the media, I think, are a little bit irresponsible in their reporting of stories. So what you'll get is the big panorama programs or the big newspaper stories around when things go wrong for people that are neurodivergent. So either when they're victims of poor practice, or when things aren't working for them, and they almost become demonised in the press. And I think I'm absolutely 100% supportive of whistleblowing bad practice. So don't misunderstand me. I think that needs to be called out. But I think those negative stories do an awful lot of damage, particularly to parents who are struggling to trust a system, and then they have their confidence repeatedly taken away from them and destroyed. And I don't mind the bad stories being out there, because I think that we've got due diligence to make sure that all practice is good. I just wish they were balanced. And I think, for a poor practice, there's probably 5,000 good practices.
Certainly, but they
don't get the same attention.
No,
so I think the media have a responsibility to dispel some myths, to be honest.
I think we are living in a world of drama. So we like the drama, we like the someone having the meltdown and seeing and criticising and everybody around there. And that is what is selling.
Yeah.
It doesn't
just
sell.
as emotionally impact to see a positive one, though, like when they have community outings, or they have where groups will meet and go to the beach and do some artwork and things like that. Like those kind of stories can also have. But like you said, I think a lot of the news outlets are kind of like, well, drama sells.
And
everybody there on TV to see, or on the newspaper, when if it's something that positive, you're like, well, okay, that's fine. And they pass it.
So
you sad.
No, absolutely. You were talking about what myths there are. And I said there are lots. So we'll cover some of them, I suppose. So one of the major myths about autism is that it affects more boys than girls. And in terms of diagnosis, there is a suggestion that the underpinning genetics of autism disproportionately favour a male diagnosis, and there's lots of myths around that. There's lots of myths that autism is a male condition, or extreme. Sometimes it's called extreme maleness. So and it's a myth, because actually autism is absolutely. It impacts girls. There is a suggestion that, particularly with high functioning autism, where there's less likely to be a learning difficulty and the impact is less severe, girls are thought to mask it more. So they go undiagnosed because they're fighting harder, and in some respects less honest because of that social peer pressure. They're fighting to fit in, and so many girls go undiagnosed until much later life. I was reading, I didn't realise that there's a TV presenter called Melanie Sykes who's has done a lot of daytime television, who's recently got a diagnosis of high functioning autism. I think she's going to be really cross with me, but either 40s or 50s, I would say. I think she's in her 40s, and again, so late diagnosis in girls does happen as much as it happens in men as well.
Maybe that's where that came from. If a load of boys were being diagnosed at an early age, And also it goes back to what we were saying about the challenging behaviours. Do you think that maybe boys are more prone to having those challenging behaviours, so then they get highlighted and they get the diagnosis quicker if the girls are masking and sort of
hiding?
And I think what often happens is that particularly females fight really hard to contain their behaviour, but parents might see a really different side, because it's like, I'll give you an example. There's an American girl called Carly Fleischman who's really worth looking at. She does loads of stuff on YouTube, and she says that she's non-verbal, but she's learned how to communicate by typing. So prior to her being able to type, there was a lot of misjudgments made about her capability, intellect, and it's fairly, she's really challenged some views, because everyone was talking about her like she was disabled, and she's this amazing brain that just didn't have an outlet for it. But one of the things that she said very early on, particularly due to sensory differences, was that her body constantly feels like you've shaken a can of Coke. And so if you think about shaking a can of Coke, it's like the pressure's building up. And she said for her, she does it through self-injury, but she self-injures, she hits her head on the floor, she screams and shouts, because there absolutely has to be an outlet for that. She can't contain it. And I think what parents see at home sometimes is their child is is doing really well and fighting really hard to contain it in school. So as soon as they get home, they can be their true self. And then the lid comes off the can of Coke and they get all this behaviour at home. And then they're thinking, this is a different child, because all the reports from school are like they're doing okay, there's no behaviours, but why does that happen? And I think, most of us in our lives won't want to show our worst moments unless we're in an environment that we feel safe in. And so, we do get these big divides between how people behave in certain situations. And we pick it up in recording sometimes. Sometimes in recording, we find that incidents happen with a certain member of staff, and it can lead us down the wrong path. We can sometimes think, what's this, what is this about this relationship? Is this the child doesn't like the staff member? Sometimes it could be the opposite. Yeah. Sometimes it can be that the staff member, they feel absolutely safe, and they know that they can be themselves, and whatever they do, it's not going to affect the staff member's judgment. They're not going to be afraid. They feel safe. Yeah. And so behaviour is most likely to happen when people feel safe.
I've certainly had that experience where you can tell that because you've set the boundaries with that child and you have built a relationship with them, it's almost like they're saying, they are saying that they're in safe hands, I suppose, or they're saying this person can handle it. Let's do it now. Yeah. And if anything, that's probably given them a bit of control. As well, and that might be an aspect of it as well. Definitely. Is that they feel like during their school day they have to retain so much energy, and then at home they're just like, like you said, I've just got to let the lid off.
I think because they know that person as well is gonna control what they cannot control. Because we see in our children that they know that they are losing control, and they need to, as you said, they need to open the can just to get everything out, which means losing control. But they know that there are key people that they will control the situation to keep them safe. And I think they are fully sure and aware of those things.
They give you these signals and these signs.
You can tell.
Sometimes they can just look at you and just say, "Are you ready?
You are the person."
This has to happen now.
And I think in terms of what schools can do, we need to build in times that we don't have to wait until the can of Coke's going to explode. We have to build in times for people to self-regulate, and we have to look quite carefully, because actually what we do sometimes in a school setting is we constantly encourage people to cope. So, the first thing that we do when someone's getting anxious is we tell them to calm down. We try and bring them back down so that the learning can continue. And actually, if you've got this building pressure, actually sometimes the best thing to do, even though it's hard, I think, sometimes to see it in the moment, is to say, do you know what, let's just let that person let that person get that twiddly for 10 minutes, knowing that that is going to bring them back down, and then learning is much more likely to happen. But I think, we have to be really self-reflective as practitioners, and sometimes we think, actually, we're not always getting that right. Maybe we're putting too much pressure on people sometimes. And I'm not to say that we shouldn't have boundaries. We actually should have boundaries. That's natural life, isn't it? We all exist within a set of boundaries. But actually, if we have to think about what our outcome is, and if we want our outcome to be learning, we have to think, how do we best support this person to learn? And sometimes that's about changing things. And I always say, I do a lot of staff training, and over a period of years, we've gone into many special schools for children at a risk of exclusion to do some behaviour work with their teams. And I always say, I'm never changing a child. What I'm generally doing is changing the staff members' perceptions, their thinking, their approach. Because actually, if we can change our approach and our thinking, we can generally get it right for the child.
And it goes back to the sensory needs and things like that as well. If you can get into their mind that, every now and then you need to roll this ball over them, and that you're going to have a better lesson. And it's just providing those provisions for them.
And it goes back to the myth as well, isn't it? Is because often what we'll say is, well, that's really inappropriate. That's not learning. That's not, they want to distract themselves. They're having a toy. No one else does that. And we take ourselves down a path based on unconscious bias or lack of understanding that actually is only going to end up with one outcome. And the outcome is that the child's not going to learn at the end of the day, because they're probably going to leave your lesson. But it's just about just trying to think, what do I want out of this, and how is the best way to get there? And being child-centred. And that sometimes takes a lot of self-reflection and a lot of honest self-appraisal to say, do you know what, sometimes I contribute to the behaviour escalation. How do I reframe that?
I think sometimes we need to think, what would I do if, instead of a child with the label of autism that is already putting things on my head and make me work this way, is a neurotypical person telling me that to speak in public, maybe I need to have a pen in the hand, because that makes me feel secure, and then I can talk, and that's like my my Twiddle, my pen. Would you tell me you cannot have the pen? You need to speak in front of 300 people without the pen.
I'll tell you not to click it. But you can hold it.
When you know, I am gonna be like, okay. You would say, no, that's fine. You can have your pen. You can have your notes. You can have whatever you want. We will respond like that. So what is the difference between me or an adult and a child that needs a Twiddle to be able to concentrate on what he's doing?
And again,
does it make sense? Like, well, we are that
it's judgments, isn't it?
Yeah, and hard with them, and then when it's us, we are like, oh no, that's fine. You can have the pen. You can.
I always say to people, parents particularly, there's a lady called Ros Blackburn. She's an English lady that has autism, and she's brilliant. She's so insightful to listen to. And she generally sort of starts as, she comes across very eloquently because she's very practiced, but she has severe autism, so she struggles with her behaviour regulation. But she always says, when I come along and do a speech, I haven't got anything sensible like notes or, I've got flappies. And she says, I keep them so that I can see them, because those are the things that enable me. That's the difference between me leaving my house or not. And if I've got a flappy or a twiddly in my pocket that I know I can get to, that's really important. But yet so often we look at those things and we say not appropriate, not age appropriate. But yet look at us with our phones. I know, I don't know why, but my watch is really important to me. I don't think that I look at my watch, I'm not conscious looking at my watch. If I don't put my watch on in the morning and I forget it, that's a really bad day at work because it's part of my routine. And I have an interest in mindfulness. So when I did a mindfulness course, one of the things that I said is, in order to challenge yourself, change where you wear your watch. If you wear it on your left, wear it on your right. Oh God, I did it for about 3 months. It really challenged me because it's changing something, isn't it? But it's important that we all have in our lives objects, possessions, things that are enablers, and we need to really think about what those are for people with a diagnosis of neurodivergence. Ros Blackburn also says that she is very good friends with someone with a physical disability, and at one point in their lives, I think they shared the same social worker, and she was saying, if you walk into this person's kitchen, it's a mini everything because they're a wheelchair user. So it's everything's tiny because it has to be at a level that they can reach. And a social worker would go, isn't this brilliant? We've enabled this person to make their meal. And they'll walk into her kitchen and go, you've got loads of toys around. They need to go away. They're not appropriate for kitchen. But we're not seeing those through the same lens. They're enabling the meal making in exactly the same way that an adapted oven is.
The furniture is low for him.
But again, my argument is it's us that need to change, not the person. And I think,
because if it works for them, then we should be supporting that. Because again, there's a positive aspect of if that allows them and enables them, then that's something that we should back
definitely.
up.
And I think the age appropriateness argument has validity, and the reason it has validity is if you've got someone that is carrying something that makes them gives them negative attention. If you've got someone that's taking a 45-year-old that's carrying a massive teddy bear into a supermarket, and that's going to get them an awful lot of negative attention, we have to work with that person to think, where's the balance? And actually, is it okay that we get that? We had it with one of our youngsters many years ago. They started with a huge teddy bear, and they'd wear it on the head as well, which was hard to hide because it's very obvious. And while that wasn't a problem for them in most places, actually it was getting them some quite negative attention. And over a period of time, the teddy bear got smaller and smaller, and actually they ended up carrying it in a rucksack. It's fine, isn't it? It's there if they want it. If they wanted to get the teddy bear out because they're feeling a bit anxious, absolutely fine. But again, it's about being reasonable and working with someone to try and understand the importance of that item for them, and then do confidence. It absolutely.
So you said, even though it was in the backpack and you didn't physically have it just helped the confidence that it was there. Yeah, certainly.
Made the right adjustments, is it?
Yeah, of course.
Right.
We've covered like one myth. I'm sorry. it's too much to talk about.
For it.
There's a reason that you can do a degree in autism, right? There's a lot to talk about. So I think another key myth is sometimes we call it the Rain Man effect. It's this notion that people with autism have a savant skill. So a savant skill is this particular area of excellence or genius. So for those people that have watched Rain Man, they will, it's a particularly American film, isn't it, but they will know that Rain Man had this mathematical genius, and he broke some casinos because he went and counted cards, and he had this photographic memory, and it was money making, and all of these things. That comes from a point of truth, in that autism can coexist with a condition called savantism. It's really rare. Okay, so there are many savants, often art savants. So there's a guy, a British guy called Stephen Wiltshire that's very famous. Again, he's got a photographic memory. So you'll see him because when the London Eye first opened, he went on like one rotation of the London Eye, and then he'll do this amazing sort of absolutely like a carbon copy drawing with like every building right, it's amazing. So he's actually got an art gallery in London and New York now, where his art is just celebrated across the world. And I think, Lorena, one of your questions that you asked me to have a think about was success stories. Massive success story. So his savant skill has become his vocation. Yeah. And again, there's others. Daniel Tammet has savantism. He holds the world record for reciting the mathematical equation pi. He could beat a computer. So he does it to, I don't know, it's over 1,000 decimal places. So if you would say to him, divide 1,340 by 92, within a couple of seconds, he would be able to beat the computer. And so, no one really understands why savantism happens. It can also happen with acquired brain injury. So there's been some cases over the years where people have had sort of car accidents, and they develop savant skills. So there's definitely something to do with brain processing. But the myth is that everyone with autism has a savant skills. It's really rare. But it can happen. Do you think
that escalated with the because a lot of autistic people have an obsession of some description, which is usually a coping mechanism. Yeah. But do you reckon that's something that may have pushed that misconception?
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah. Again, I think the media has an awful lot of responsibility there. It tends to do those things that get in the media, but it can sometimes lead to misperceptions and myths. Yeah. I think another one is that autism can be cured, and we know that autism is a lifelong condition. So if you have a diagnosis of autism, you're going to have it for the rest of your life. It doesn't mean that your life is going to be limited, but it's something that you're going to have have supports in place to manage, and those supports are going to vary in throughout your life. So as we all do, mental health is a continuum, and we're going to have ups and downs on it. People with autism throughout their lives are going to face challenges and have periods of time where they struggle more with coping and resilience than other times. But we know that it can't be cured, and that myth has been quite damaging over time, and certainly sort of in the 90s and in the early millennium, lots and lots of parents felt really under pressure to find the next cure, so to find the next treatment fad. So look, at my time, working with people with autism, there's been, I distinctly remember a time at Loddon where we were ordering Guernsey milk, and all the children were just having Guernsey milk because that was a treatment fad, and sometimes parents would be really under pressure to get their child to go and swim with dolphins because that would cure them. And I think, so there's been lots.
Special needs teaching, and they came that the dolphins was like a really good strongest stream in there.
And some of them have been really damaging based on what we know about autism now. So, some of the myths have come from things like autism is about poor parenting, and a child isn't, because of poor parenting, a child isn't properly bonded. And there was a terrible treatment fad called holding therapy at a period of time where, parents were almost encouraged to force a bond by holding their child really tightly until they became exhausted. Everything we know about sensory and tactile differences now will tell you that had the potential to be a massive sort of cause of trauma for both the parent and the child, not necessarily a treatment. But I think parents are faced quite a lot of pressure, and that's why it's been very positive, I think, that that there was a piece of research commissioned to say, look, there is no absolute cure for your child's autism. There are many things that can help. There are many support strategies, but stop looking for a cure, because actually, it's not there. This is lifelong. And I think that's really helped with acceptance, and it's helped shift again that perspective of, this is something that we can that we can just take away, because autism is a key part of people's personalities, and the vast majority of people with autism, when asked a question, given a choice, would you have it or not, they want it because it's part of them, and so it's part of their identity, and it gives them strengths and insights and creativity that many people that are neurotypical don't have. And so again, it's judgment fueled. It's one of those things that we've got to be really careful that we don't say this is something to cure.
So Helen, we were talking about how autism is a spectrum. So what are some of the effective strategies for improving communication skills for non-verbal individuals with autism?
So I guess this goes back to an immediate myth, really. An immediate myth that we have is that people that don't speak are less intelligent, and that's just not the case. So some of our non-verbal children are really well able to get their message across through other means rather than words. So I think we have to recognise that from sort of understanding but also expression, words are a moment in time, they're a second in time. So sometimes if you're having a conversation with someone with autism that's non-verbal and they're trying to process what you're saying, as their anxiety escalates, their ability to retain information is going to seriously sort of reduce. So I think we often say that you need sort of non-fade cues, and what I mean by that is the words have disappeared, but you need to supplement the words with something that is still there as a visible reminder. So one of the most effective strategies that we use, and we've used lots of different ones over the years, is photos. So we find photos really good because you can take a photo of, I don't know, I'm going to go to biscuits, a custard cream or a bourbon or digestive, and it's that real item. Whereas if you use a sort of a pictogram system or a line drawing system, you've got a line drawing of a biscuit, it still doesn't tell you whether it's the custard cream or the digestive. So photos are really concrete, and that we found really, really helpful. And that's both expressive and receptive. So if you're communicating with someone, having a photo of a shared point of reference, but also giving youngsters really good access to photos to be able to identify needs and choices. Now, obviously, concepts are much harder to demonstrate through photo, so things like finish or or more, much harder. So we tend to use a fairly eclectic approach where we've got different sort of symbols, but again, Dave, as you said, it's person-centered, so not one size fits all. So you've got to explore a range of strategies that works and fit the child.
Something from my position is Makaton, because I'm in the speech and language therapy department. I find some children really respond to Makaton more than pictures. And especially when they're trying to tell you something, they'd much rather go like this than point to a picture. But, and it's language, isn't it? So and I think again, I know that this is a repeated theme, is that we need to change rather than expect the child to change, but we have the flexibility and the skill set to adapt our language. So, we can train everyone in Makaton, we can train everyone in using photos, we can train everyone, hopefully not too much training required, but we can train everyone in speaking in the right way. But what we often find happens is that we revert back to our choice and our language. So, you don't see, I think we're very good at doing it, we're very good at reinforcing it within our setting, but we still constantly have to remind people to use the photo book, to use the Makaton. Staff will revert back to their choice, which is language, even though it's not necessarily the preference for the child. And I often say, I'm not very fluent in other languages, but if I suddenly started talking in a different language, if I suddenly started talking in Polish or talking in Greek, or most of the audience would switch off after a few minutes. They might try and stay with me for a couple, but they're going to switch off because I'm not talking a shared language. And that's exactly the same as not using a photo book or not using Makaton signing if it's that child's preferred method of speaking, a method of understanding and expressing themselves. So again, I guess the technical terminology is AAC, so that stands for sort of alternative and augmentative communication, but it's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about a total communication system that might feature Makaton, that might feature photos, that might feature pictures, that might feature speech, it might feature typing for some children. So some of our youngsters are really tech savvy. I talked to you about a young lady earlier that was non-verbal and couldn't speak, but suddenly was able to type. So giving people the opportunity to have a voice in whatever way that works for them,
is so essential, because we know that there are huge links between communication and behaviour, because most behaviour happens because the person is unable to communicate what they need at that time. So if we can get communication right for a youngster or an adult with autism, we see an immediate decrease in their stress levels, an immediate decrease in restrictive behaviours.
I've recently had that experience. I went to Spain recently, and obviously I'm surrounded by people, and I find it very frustrating sometimes when I couldn't quite understand what was going on, or suddenly I was being flung into a car.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we talked about this. Oh, but I said it in Spanish. Oh, yeah. And things like that sort of keep popping up where you go, oh, now we're in a car. Okay. And I can see how that could, with someone with that has those misconceptions and doesn't quite understand, how suddenly being thrown into a situation can be quite daunting.
And I think most people can relate to that. Again, we talked earlier about doing training abroad. That's a different experience because everything has to go through a translator. But when I have been abroad, certainly training in Azerbaijan, going out for meals in the evening when there's no shared language. There's no shared language from a spoken sense, but there's also no shared language in terms of the writing, because they use a different script. And you can then see the role of fear, because actually you start being very fearful about people's interactions with you because you don't have the reassurance and the comfort or the rapport. So, I distinctly remember being in a restaurant and thinking, and it was a little bit of a tumbleweed moment, because I didn't realise that in Azerbaijan, cafes are only for men. And myself and a female colleague had strolled into a cafe on the first night, and it was a little bit of a moment where it was like, it really challenged people because it wasn't a societal norm. Opened a menu, couldn't read what was written because it's a different script, didn't have a shared language, felt very under pressure because, these British women are over here and what's going on, and it was really socially awkward. And actually in that conversation, I say conversation, there was a lot of gesturing going on, and a lot of body language, which of course is what autistic people then
I highlight this when I'm training staff, and I say sometimes if you're sitting here like this, or you've got very closed body language, they pick up on that. And it's something to think about. You may be using the preferred method of communication, but if you're not doing it in a positive way or an engaging way, then all they're going to see is probably the body language. So,
and it comes from fear, doesn't it? I mean, actually, what we did,
like a smile can just totally reassure someone.
Definitely, and what we did in that sense was we ended up, the guy that owned the restaurant or the cafe was asking us to come with him, sort of through gesture. We were sort of thinking, I don't know what to do here, and we did, and he ended up taking us out the back into his kitchen and opening all the drawers and pointing at bits of food, and then basically giving us his version of a Makaton. So we had chicken impressions going on, but actually it's shared language, isn't it? And I think that was an important lesson for me, which is you can't necessarily rely on words, you can't necessarily rely on writing, but why Makaton and sign is so important and gesture is so important is because it's often a shared language that cuts across culture. Or language barrier, but it's something that we have to be very mindful of getting communication right, because as I say, without communication the fear increases significantly, and as a result of that restrictive behaviour is much more likely to happen. So so important to get, and I think you've touched on the strategies, Dave, in terms of intensive interaction and mimicking and rapport building strategies that underpin communication.
I think it's key to let them understand that we talk the same language. I think when you talk about being a foreigner in another country, this is what I experienced when I came to England. It's like people start talking English really quickly, and then they turn around the face and the other way around. They use words that you don't know because it's slang and it's not the English that they teach you in Spain. And then you're like, ay Dios mío, what? Excuse me, what? And you're constantly like, so you are at a point like, how many times I can ask, excuse me again, or can you repeat? Or so at some point you're masking, you're like, you didn't understand, but so the person thinks,
you're building up
but you're not linking with anybody. Meanwhile, as soon as you listen Spanish somewhere, you go straight to that person because it's a really strong link.
Absolutely.
You feel that, oh, there you go, that one is going to understand me. Even if you don't know her or him, you don't even coming from the same country, you've never seen each other before, but there's already a link, straightforward.
And that's
so I think we need to link with them.
That's exactly what our children will do. If their predominant language is Makaton, and they've got one member of staff that's brilliant at it, they're going to be there like a shot, because it's exactly the same. Actually, we've got a responsibility to make sure everyone's brilliant with their chosen language. So yeah, we invest heavily in it, but as I say, human nature sometimes means that when our anxiety escalates, we go back to our preferred choice, which often is a mismatch between the child's. Okay, so again, reflective practice, really, really important.
Talking about restrictive behaviours, because sometimes is how what our children come across when they have a bad moment where we said that probably will bend with our colleagues, and then they don't have the ability, so they will display restrictive behaviours because there is a lack of communication, or because we're having a bad day, or because they feel bad, because sometimes they have like an illness, they have an earache or a stomach ache, but they are not having the resources at that moment to say, I'm actually sick, and they display those restrictive behaviours. So how we support these normally at the Loddon and outside Loddon, because you do training wider.
So I think that you could do a whole other podcast on behaviour, because it's the reason that most people end up in a provision like Loddon, most children do, because generally they've been excluded from other provisions because of their behaviour, and it's something that is a huge area of focus for us, because actually, if you've got someone that is at that level of crisis, and that they're engaging in that restrictive behaviour, it's telling you that something is not right for that child, is that we're not getting something right, and actually what we're going to do is look very holistically about that child, and we're going to look at every aspect of their life and say, what's going on for them. So and I think you're absolutely right when you talk about pain. Ruling out health needs first is really, really important, because I can't bear to think about a situation where I was in physical pain or unwell that I didn't have the ability to say, I've actually got raging toothache, or I've actually got raging stomachache, or period pain, or whatever it is, and I can't get the paracetamol myself, and I can't tell you that this really hurts, and we can see why behaviours might happen. So ruling out medical is a key really early, but then I think we have to be really observant around that behaviour. When it happens, where it happens, does it happen in particular activities, does it happen with different people, as we talked about earlier, and having an inquiring, curious, detective mind around behaviour, because actually the only way that we will support a child to move on and not have to use that behaviour is finding out what the unmet need is. So why are they demonstrating? Why are they pulling hair at that point? Why are they tipping the table over? Is that because they can't cope with the sound, because they can't filter out what we can filter out? Is that because I've come into the room wearing a perfume that they don't like? It's not necessarily visible, and we do a lot of work on trying to analyse behaviour, and we always say, what's the trigger, what's the thing that's caused the behaviour? And very often staff will say, don't know, didn't see anything, nothing really changed. Sometimes it's really obvious. This child screamed, this child responded, but you've got to look at what happened before, what happened in the moment, and what happened afterwards, to build a picture of what purpose is that behaviour serving for the child. So if everything was really, really, really quiet, and then another peer screams, and then the child uses the behaviour, or that's the point where the activity gets really noisy and the child uses their behaviour, and then funnily enough we take them to a different environment to calm down, you can start building a picture of what that behaviour is about. And if that's then about an escape related behaviour, they just want it out, actually we can then start thinking, what alternative way could we enable a child to say to us that they want to leave without needing to turn the table over. So you can then see how behaviour and communication are linked, because if you can work out what the need is, you can then work out what communication skills can we enable that child to have that means that they don't need to use the behaviour anymore.
I'm always modelling to use finish either in Makaton or the go symbol.
Yeah,
and things
it's a
like
good
that.
example, isn't it?
Yeah, because sometimes it might be something different that day. Like you could have all the knowledge about the child there with you, that this triggers and this triggers, but then on the day it might be something like you said, that when they turn around you go, I don't know.
Yeah.
But if they've got that ability to say, I need to go now. Yeah. Then we are able to de-escalate. Yeah. So
I think an example for me that was really striking is that we had a young lady that we were supporting to go out into the community, and that was part of her sort of development plan, and it was a reward system actually. She'd earned some money through for doing housekeeping and doing the things that she wanted to do, and she had chosen to go out in the community, and she really struggled with sensory processing. So one of the things that she did was have headphones on, and she played music because it would be a filter, and it just so happened it was going really, really well, and it just so happened that one day she was in a local restaurant and she became really, really upset. And of course, you know, what happens is it unfortunately, when it comes to behaviour, is it takes a really long time for opportunities to open up for our youngsters, and not very much for those opportunities to close back down again because of risk assessment. And she got really upset in the restaurant, and the staff were thinking, okay, look, we did a debrief, and the staff were thinking, like, what happened? She had her headphones on, we'd got all the supportive strategies in place, and bless her, we got back to school and we realised that the batteries had gone. And and it was just as simple as making sure that the batteries were on in her stereo. And again, all of the judgments, all of the consequences, of course, are for the child, not for everyone else, because then we've got to re-risk assess. And actually, you know, we learn from that very, very quickly. And it's that constant learning, isn't it? But sometimes we overcomplicate matters and we look for historic patterns, and it can just be as simple as, have you got the support strategy right? Is it in place? Have you got spare batteries with you? And so, but again, it's that constant questioning. It's that constant reflection of what happened, when did it happen, what was happening, to try and stay ahead of the game, really, but have an evidence base for that as well.
And I think communicating with your team as well is very important. I remember a child got upset again in a restaurant, and I said, oh, did you let him see all the exits? This is something that he needs. And then you're like, okay, and that didn't happen this time, we had a problem, so now let's put that in the guidelines, and let's make sure everybody knows that he's going to have a pleasant time as long as he knows where all the exits are. Something as simple as that is important for him.
Definitely.
And it's important to share that with your team, and then everyone can approach the situation the same way.
And I think also, particularly in a residential setting, we have to be really careful that we don't immediately think we've got to do something about all that behaviour, because actually, you know, some behaviour might be a coping strategy for a child. So actually, we might need to enable a safe way for that child to engage in that behaviour, but our starting point shouldn't be, we've got to change it, we've got to change it, we've got to change it. Our starting point would be, what purpose does it serve for the child? You know, and is it something that we have to change on a risk assessment? You know, or is it something that actually, if we allow... So going back to the Carly Fleischman, you know, her behaviour was self-injury. If she didn't self-injure safely in that moment, and they provided her padding to do that, she was constantly feeling like there was no release. You know, so for her, enabling that to happen safely 3 times a day gave her brilliant quality of life. But actually, if someone had said, we've got to stop the self-injury, her anxiety levels and her quality of life would have been, you know, higher and less. So you've got to think about why you're changing things. And actually, you know, we've got a really good longitudinal data set for our children over years and years and years, and we know that, you know, strategies, holistic strategies and eclectic strategies generally get really good outcomes with behaviour. And we've had amazing success stories of children that have come in with really narrow worlds because of their behaviour, that is opened up, and their quality of life is brilliant. And of course, you know, that, and by brilliant, you know, I mean brilliant in the context of what they want to do and what contribution they can make. So brilliant isn't measured, success isn't measured by what I think. It's measured by what is relevant to them and in their best interest. But we absolutely know that while someone is exhibiting lots and lots of challenging and restrictive behaviours, something's not right, it's telling you something, and then it becomes our responsibility to explore it and figure out why.
Yeah, I think I see down in reviews at school, and then you can see the progress. And one thing that we advocate many times is don't see the small steps as nothing. The small steps contribute to the big pathway. It's like you don't do a long pathway if you don't start stepping one step after another. And then this is what this particular child is doing. It's just stepping forward to arrive to the end. And then we see parents saying that I can see the difference, I can see the impact, I can see that he's even more content, he can self-regulate better, he can tell us when he's upset. And then you see actually why he is upset now, because it's the way to vent it out, or when he's actually doing something else, instead of having that restrictive behavior, he's telling us this is finished, instead of having a meltdown in a restaurant, and then we just need to take I'm thinking about a specific child that was with family in a restaurant, and then they could tell when things were like, this is becoming enough, and then the child said, this is actually enough. And then they just took out, but in the meanwhile she was able to be having dinner with siblings, with mum and dad. Meanwhile before it was just a separate family, because one of the parents needed to be with her and the other parent needed to be with the other two, and it wasn't like a family dinner or a family vacation, or it was kind of separated. Now it can be together, and she has the ability, or is building the ability to say, I had enough.
It's definitely those little
just
steps and
move
those,
me away. It's time to go. And we need to consider that our children don't have the ability to say, I need a paracetamol. I had enough of you. I am upset because of this happened. Sometimes I'm upset because I couldn't go on the bus and I wanted to go, and they don't have the ability to say, and that comes like what they call the tantrum or the crisis point, let's say, because I don't like the tantrum thing. For them it's like anger, and it's the way to take the anger out. We're talking about research, and then you talking about London, you were mentioning that it's like a constant research, isn't it? You always prove, like, is it right, is it wrong, will it work, will it not, what we need to adjust. And then you've been adjusting in the history of 35 years.
Yeah, getting that way, I think.
Yeah, because London is 1988 as I am,
yeah.
so
I've got same age as you.
I've got under control. So I think that you have like a long way to be researching and trying things. So can you tell us a little bit how this research has impacted the quality of life in the children, the quality of the practice that we do, raising the standards to a really good standards?
Yeah,
I would say.
Things change, practices change, our understanding and knowledge changes, and I think, you know, if I think about, we have something in Loddon where we will have a payroll number, so, you know, I don't know what number you are, I think my number's probably a little bit less than your numbers, and it's about, you know, the number of staff member that you are on the books, and I look back and I think, you know, of all of that collective knowledge and the collective experience we've got, we've evolved and we've shaped good practice. But practice changes, and practice will continue to change, and we will continue to learn. But I think, you know, it's really hard. I think it's really hard to measure. And I think what I would say is we are very creative, and we're very flexible, and we're very willing to try things. So what happens, I think, around autistic provisions sometimes is that, let's say you have something in place, so structured teaching, whatever it might be, you have something in place that is research driven, and that becomes part of the organisational identity, that becomes part of, this is what we do, and that's not to say that doesn't work, and it does for many places. We've never done that. We've always said, brilliant, we've tried this, it works for these 3 children, so we'll keep that for these 3 children. Now let's try this, and then maybe this approach works for these 3 children. So we have a very eclectic menu of things and that collective experience that we can think, right, okay, let's file back, you know, let's see. We've got all of this stuff, that strategies, support mechanisms that may or may not help this new child to the school. And I think that flexibility is really, really important. So I think it's about not limiting yourself by any one strategy. David, you talked about it. Intensive interaction, really powerful. It's not for every child, but it adds to a menu of things.
Yes.
And that's the approach that we take with everything, really.
Because some of them just want things, they don't want to be told what to do. Some children, I find. Some children want to have a very clear structure. Yeah. They're not up for the playfulness. You know, and like you said, it works for this child, it doesn't work for that child. Yeah. So being creative and flexible is important. I think
absolutely what we've learned over the years is the power of personalisation. Is that you can't have one approach. The personalisation has to come from really good relationships and really good knowledge and understanding of that child. And then you can start building on strategies, building on support, building on activities that are relevant. And something that we have learned very, very quickly. When I first started at Loddon, we still had classrooms. And I think probably in my second week of being a teaching assistant at Loddon, we had Ofsted in. And I remember, you know, it was the Ofsted's expectations about science. And I distinctly remember it was the first time some of these children had seen a metre rule, but we were measuring the courtyard area, and it was completely chaotic because, you know, it was a tick box. And it's one of those aha moments that you just think, why are we doing this? To what benefit are we really doing this?
What's the purpose of this?
Exactly. But we did still have classrooms, and over a period of years we learned that actually we spent quite a lot of time outside the classroom trying to encourage a child to go in the classroom to engage with learning. But of course most of our children have got, unfortunately, a really negative association with classrooms because they don't fit that system. So what we did that was really powerful was say, okay, let's stop this traditional method, let's stop this traditional thinking around classrooms and groups, and then let's, you know, God forbid, let's think about what the child really enjoys, and let's build the curriculum around preferred activities. So, you know, if you've got a child that really likes being outside in the grounds, really likes horse riding, really likes going and collecting the eggs from the chickens, we can embed curriculum subjects into that. You know, we
like
can,
forest school.
Yeah, so forest school is a perfect example of that. And because, of course, a key thing about behaviour is getting the environment right. And if your environment is wrong, you're onto a loser straight away. So those sorts of things. So really understanding intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and recognising that if you can build your learning around things that the child absolutely enjoys, they're much more likely to be engaged in the activity. And that is probably, I think that's probably the most powerful thing. That happened a long time ago at Loddon, but it's the most powerful thing that we've achieved, is just that bravery to go, we're going to do it differently. We've got a responsibility actually for our children to do it differently, because why recreate something for them that's not worked historically? So yeah, it's absolutely a nightmare in terms of staffing. It's absolutely logistically, you know, no organisation would say, I want 30 different timetables. It's resource heavy and it's really challenging. Why do we continue doing it? Because it's really effective and it has a positive impact on the child's quality of life. So it's absolutely worth it, even if it's a bit of a headache at times in terms of implementation.
I think it's more because sometimes often inspections come and they need to tick their boxes of things that they need to look into, and it's when things clash a little bit and then you need to explain, look, this is not ticking your box as you expect, but if you let me explain to you, you will see that at the end it ticks the box, because actually we are aiming for having happy kids that actually learn and progress. And this is what you're looking for, and this is what happens here.
Yeah. You've got to change the mindset.
It might not look into how your box looks like, but definitely we are aiming for the same thing. And I think the inspectors being lucky,
it's ticking your box if the kid is counting, but if we do it in a music session, because that's what engages them, then we're still ticking the box.
Yeah, and then behaviours drop down massively. You know, you see those little steps going and moving forward. So definitely there are improvement there, and then the quality of life increasing massively. Even parents are telling you, I can see my son or my daughter in a different.
It's hard to argue against that, isn't it?
Yeah,
you know, it might look different. The journey might look a little bit different, but as long as the outcomes are positive ones that are meaningful, you know, why does it matter that it looks different? You know, but it's, as I say, it's taken us many years of practice to feel brave enough to just say, let's do something differently.
Enough.
Yeah.
So let's move on to what are the main barriers and challenges that exist in providing adequate support and services for individuals with autism?
I think probably a theme of this podcast is a lack of understanding sometimes, and society's sort of judgments or misjudgments and misunderstanding around autism and neurodivergence. So I think that's a barrier for people, but it's a barrier for families as well. So often people feel misunderstood or judged. And I think, look, I don't want to get too political about it, but I have a personal view that at our current point in society, we're almost at a point where there's more disparity, and you know, in a lot of different sort of social values, really, I think, and it's really hard to be different. And I think we live in a society that human nature, we have the ability to be kind and tolerant and inclusive, but on the flip side of that, we have the ability to really impact people if we don't do those things. And I think more recognition that autism isn't a disability, more recognition that autism isn't a deficit or a negative, and more recognition that, you know, people with autism are brilliant people that can contribute to society in an equal way from neurotypical people. If we can get that inclusivity and tolerance, and I just think, for me, the start and end point should always be kindness and open-mindedness, and I think that will overcome an awful lot of barriers.
I think it's what Andy was saying last month in the podcast, is see what are the strengths for that person?
Yeah, absolutely.
How that person can, what can that person give to me? And then from there we go.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing, oh, he's autistic, he's the weird guy, or the weird girl, or, you know, instead of seeing the negative, he's turning to the other side.
Yeah.
What are the strengths? Let's push for those ones and get the best and as much as we can from there.
So what advice would you give to families and caregivers who may feel a bit overwhelmed by the challenges of raising a child with autism?
Yeah, that's really important, I think, because I think having, particularly in the early stages of getting a diagnosis, I think that can be a frightening space for families. It can be overwhelming, and it can be really isolating. So, you know, very often, as I said earlier, families have to completely change their expectations and hopes, and it takes a period of readjustment. And I think reaching out and finding what support is available is so important. So to stop the isolation, because although this seems like no one else is experiencing this, no one else is having the sleepless nights, or, you know, having to have rebuilt your dining room for the third time because there's been meltdowns, and it seems sometimes it can feel quite hopeless, I think, for families. But I think and it's hard to reach out because you feel fearful of being judged. But if you can reach out and find out what's in your local community, you will find that you're not by yourself, and there are things that will help, and there are, whether that's other parents or whether that's professionals, that are not there to judge and are there to just sort of say, I get it, I know this is tough, these are things that might help you in the future, these are things that we can put in place now, you know, let's just try this. And I think sometimes parents don't have the capacity, they're so tired, to be honest, they don't have the capacity to read a book. But you don't have to read a book to learn what's right for your child. You are the bearer of knowledge around your child. You need people to listen to you to be able to say, oh, I wonder whether it is because of this, that and the other. I wonder whether if you just tried this, or maybe if you put a few photos in place, you know, if you're able to share what your barriers and your difficulties are, other people have read the books, other people have got the experience that can help you. And I think, you know, one thing, just an example that Loddon Training offer is parent drop-ins. They offer parent coffee mornings, just as a really safe, non-judgmental space to come in and have a cup of tea and a cake with a range of professionals that will just sort of say, how's it going for you? How's the week been? Is there anything that particularly you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about behaviour? Do you want to talk about communication? What are the things that you're finding most challenging? And let's see, either just to listen or to advise or to give you ideas. And I think, you know, that's a really good thing. So often parents like the face-to-face. Often parents struggle with face-to-face because actually they can't find their time in their day where they're not looking after their child. So, you know, I'd encourage parents to think about what other media is available. So, you know, we're doing a podcast at the minute. Hopefully those sorts of things help parents. But video clips, you know, online tutorials. There's actually a lot of good autism resources that are online now. There's some, like anything on social media, there's some variable quality. And I would always go to start with reputable sites. So the National Autistic Society is a really good place to start. They signpost a lot of information. They will also have local links. So most societies will have a local sort of autism branch, and even if that's the starting point where they can say, do you know what, there's these parent support groups, or you might want to have a look at this online, or, you know, there's some funded training. If you're really interested in finding out the theory, it doesn't have to be in books or research articles, you know, it can be in this free e-learning. So it's just, I think it's very daunting for parents to work out what the offer is, but it is plentiful. You just might need a bit of help for someone else to support you to find it. Okay, but I would say, even though probably screaming inside you're thinking, I'm completely isolated, feeling very lonely, feeling very overwhelmed, the hardest thing to do is ask for help. But once you've done it, it gets a lot easier.
I think it's handy when you tell the story and you're like, oh, actually, I'm not the only one. Because sometimes you feel that you are isolated and it's like, it's only me, it's only my child, I don't know what to do, now what? Yeah. it's only me, and then you go out and then it's like, oh, actually it's not only me.
Yeah, and having those discussions with people, you can even figure out stuff for yourself just by talking about it.
Yeah.
I find it's not so much, I mean, obviously it's nice to be surrounded by these experts, but sometimes they might express something and then learn something just by expressing it. And
they won't have all the answers. You know, they won't have all the answers, but they might have a little golden nugget of something that really changes something for you in your home life, and it works. So, you know, just get as many of those nuggets as you possibly can, I think. I think the other thing that I'd say to parents is they will feel that their whole energy and their whole existence is going towards their child, and there's a whole range of emotions that go with that. There's guilt, you know, there's probably a bit of resentment, and you can be a really harsh self-critic as a parent of a child that's different. And I think, again, recognising that all of those emotions are completely normal. You know, they're completely normal because, you know, life has thrown something that wasn't part of your grand plan, and that's going to take a period of adjustment, you know, too. So being kind to yourself, I think, is really, really important. And but having an outlet of being able to share with other people, and that's why parent support groups are so important. You know, you have license to say, actually, yesterday was awful, and actually there are points where I really struggled to find those positives about my child because I haven't slept for 2 days. You know, I'm not suggesting that that's typical, but everyone's going to have those moments, and feeling in a safe space to be able to share those outside of someone that is, you know, writing something down on a clipboard, for example, and doing an assessment is really important. So I think self-care for parents is really important. So just, you know, there's that old adage, isn't there, that you can't pour from an empty pot. You've got to look after yourself before you look after someone else. So making sure that you do the basics of self-care well, you know, that's eating, sleeping, and I know that there'll be challenges to that, but just looking after yourself well so that you can stay resilient, so that you're best placed to look after your child. But you're not alone, so don't feel like you've got to do it alone, but find out what's in your local community.
Right, with those, you're not alone, and look after yourself. We are going to wrap up our episode today. We'll make sure that all this information about the coffee shop workshops are they here in the Field House?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
All the information is in our podcast information. So, like Nairobi will put that. So whoever that wants to come along, they are more than invited. You are our guests, guys. So here we are. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us on our second episode of On the Spectrum. Please do follow and like us and subscribe. And until next time, stay on the spectrum.